Hello, thank you very much for coming. And I know on a night like this, it's really difficult to tear yourself away from a warm room and a glass of dry white wine, probably not for the younger ones, maybe a Red Bull. But hopefully what you will get today is a sort of a flavour of what it's like to be a science journalist, a science writer, science broadcaster. And in the process, it should... Well, that's how I think of my job. It's completely illuminating in terms of the scientists that I meet often on a daily basis and the work that they do. And it's quite astonishing. And I sort of wish I was clever enough to be a scientist. And when you hear some of about some of the people I've worked with, you'll understand why. What I do at the moment is I'm editor of The Biologist, which is the magazine for the Society of Biology. I make podcasts. One is on environmental science called the Planet Earth Podcast. One on space science called Space Boffins. I was a BBC science correspondent for television news for 8 years. I presented on Radio 4 for about 20 years on and off, which is embarrassing to say, on science series and documentaries, and as has been mentioned, also write. So if you've any questions at the end about the media side of science, I'd be more than happy to attempt to answer those questions. And I also work for the European Space Agency, making films, hence the sort of rocket side of this. So that's me skulking behind a microphone while actually making a podcast. And just to give you an idea of, there's no such thing as a sort of an ordinary day, which is why I like what I do so much. So, for example, yesterday morning I was in London interviewing some space scientists for the Space Boffins podcast. In the afternoon I was interviewing 2 scientists by the River Thames in Oxfordshire about drought. One works for the British Geological Survey, one works for the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And the irony of it, of course, as we were talking about drought, it started to rain. This morning, I went to the University of Hertfordshire, but just to help out a PhD student who's doing a robotics experiment to try to get people who have stroke to be more mobile. And so I spent this morning holding a robotic arm, looking at a computer, and then when the screen would tell me where to move, I had to follow it, and the machine measured the resistance that I would put in, whether it was okay for me to move it, and they're going to apply that to patients, and it's already been trialled in certain hospitals, and they're trying to sort of advance it. So no day is the same. But to be honest, I don't think there was any indication that I would become so interested in science when I was young. Or you might want to disagree. So I sort of, we're talking Geek Central here. National Health specs, for those who remember that these are what you had. You didn't have Specsavers. I couldn't have gone to Specsavers. They're National Health glasses. And yes, it's an era when you were 11, you looked 11. I begged my parents not to buy that. I cried. And now I've come round to sort of accept it. Okay, So this was me aged 11, completely into science already, because my junior school teacher was also into science, and that's what started me off. Like so many people who say what got them into science, it's usually a teacher. And I had an amazing science teacher called Mr. Bowen, who was Welsh, and also used to make us play rugby in the playground in between it. And 3 years after this photo was taken, I was so into science, I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be an astronaut. So I wrote to NASA, age 14, because then there wasn't a UK space agency. If you wanted to go into space, you pretty much had to be American. And NASA wrote back and encouraged me to keep on studying my favourite subject, which I told them was physics. And they sent me a technical manual for their new space plane, the Shuttle, which I still have. And although I never did get to become an astronaut, I feel as though I've sort of ended up doing the next best thing with regards to lots of things about space science. And although I actually did go on, I continued with physics and studied physics at university, but my first job had a sort of sciencey theme to it, but wasn't quite what I ended up doing now. And in fact, I was a studio manager for the BBC. And so like Esther Ranson, if everybody knows her, she was a studio manager. A lot of DJs, if you listen to Radio 4 in the morning, Charlotte Green with the wonderful voice, she was a studio manager as well. There are an awful lot of former studio managers around. And that is a mixing desk that I trained on. The same desk is in it like a museum piece now at BBC Bush House with a little bit of glass around it. They had rotary faders. So the mixing desks that you see now, which I also trained on after these were the sort of ones that they had at the World Service for all the language sections, do look more like, you know, the cockpit at Concorde or something. Oh God, that's obsolete now, isn't it? It's showing my age. But they do, you know, look like that. But this was exactly what I started on. So having actually a science background was pretty useful for that, because in order to become a studio manager, it's effectively like a sound engineer. You're the person that operates the mixing desks in the radio studios. Then they had tape machines before it was all digital, and records and gramophones. They called them grams for gramophones. And I also got to the studio managers, and this still happens. They're the ones who do the sound effects in drama. Because if you've got an actor, it's not like TV where an actor memorizes their line and learns their lines. In radio, the actor may well, you know, read through their script again so that they rehearse the intonation, their accent. But actually, when it comes to recording it, they've got their script. So if they're holding their script in one hand, they can't hold a teacup and rattle it with the other. So you would have the actor standing there and the studio manager, and I would be stood over there with a little microphone rattling their teacup and stirring it. And we had a little wooden box with little doors on, so if they were coming into a door, you would open the relevant. You had different locks that you would do, all in the same thing, little doorbells, so you'd operate the doorbells, and that's what I would actually do. And you also had, if somebody was pouring a glass of wine, you would pour the bottle for them, and you would open the bottle too. And you don't actually constantly open wine bottles. You have a bicycle pump, which has string attached to it and a cork. And you put the cork in it, and you use your bicycle pump, and when it's time, then they're going as if to open the bottle, and you go, and it goes, and that's it. And as a sort of reminder, I wondered if any of you could guess what I've used this as a studio manager, my first job. Anyone any idea what it might have been used for? Walking across snow or ice. Oh, it could well be. I didn't know that. It could well be. No, actually, it was for me. Oh, yeah. Execution. Yeah, very similar. Yeah. You can do it for that. You can chop someone's head off. The sound of a cabbage landing is a nice sound of a hand. In fact, we can try this. Let's see. Yeah, not bad. But in fact, the reason I used it was a drama. It was a classical drama, and it was either, I think it was it was set in ancient Rome. And I had to do sword fighting with the other studio manager for them. So the actors would just be holding their script, going, ah, ooh, ah. And the two studio managers would be there going, but what this was for was when they were stabbed. It makes the sound, if you put a knife in it, close to a mic, it really sounds horrible. So the actor would go like that, and I would be sat on the floor cross-legged with the microphone going, and by the end of 10 rehearsals, you just coleslaw all around. And I thought, and I've not done it actually, I've got through health and safety, I brought a knife into the school. So I'll do it here. I will say I haven't done this in a long time, but we'll see if it sounds like that. How did that sound? Did that sound pretty horrible? See, it's very effective. So you can see I sort of got somewhat distracted, really, from the science side, sitting on a studio floor stabbing a cabbage. And I must admit that that was the point where I began to think, am I in the right job? I thought, you know, I've got a physics degree. Maybe I should be using it here. But I still didn't get to where I wanted to, you know, eventually where I got to do. I worked for Radio Merseyside, presenting a local writers program. I was an arts journalist for Channel 4 for a year, an arts reporter. I was a travel writer on and off for 8 years, writing travel features, and wrote comedy as well. But there was always that lure of going back to the science, particularly for me, the physics, that I still really liked, which is how I ended up going sort of back after working for 5 years, went back to school effectively, did a postgraduate in journalism, and after that got asked to be the first science presenter for 5 Live, as is now. And that's when it started, and I got back into it. And what I wanted to sort of share with you are just a few of the programs I've made since then that, for me, have really moved me, or I've just been so completely into, and why I love the subject, because it can vary from cutting-edge science to historical science and what's gone on before. And this was a documentary I did for Radio 4 called The Harvard Computers. And I came across the computers in this case, Harvard, yeah, based in Harvard and Boston in America. Computer doesn't mean you're sort of, you know, your Apple Mac. It means here, it was short for computing something. So they were like, so that's why they called them computers, because they did computational work. And they were around at the end of the 19th century onwards at astronomical observatories around the States. There were computers were effectively low-paid, mostly men at one point, with some women, low-paid men who would do what they called the computing, which was analysing pictures of stars. Now, it wasn't a case of like this, when you use, you know, a big, nice space telescope and all your wonderful space observatories, be it Herschel or Hubble or soon to happen as James Webb Space Telescope. We know now there are 100 billion, approximately 100 billion galaxies in our universe, and each of those galaxies contains 100 billion stars. So there are an awful lot of stars out there. So this is what, you know, an amazing telescope can get. This is what they had to deal with. Photographic plates. No digital cameras, no digital images. And these photographic plates, each one of those is about the size, sort of about that square, about the size of an old 78 record. And it was glass, because that's what the image was on. And the images for stars were negatives when they came to look at the stars on these photographic plates. So they were usually they looked like little bits of grey or black, almost like ash was flicked on a photographic plate. And what the computers would do was look at them and analyse how big and how bright that star was, and work out where they were in the sky. And they would effectively like producing a catalogue of where all the stars were and how bright they were. They would also, and this is how they do it. I mean, it looks like some Victorian, you know, that maybe perhaps a woman in the front is doing a tapestry or something. But no, that one of the photographic plates is on there. And you can see she's got a little microscope. And that's what they're doing, this really close work. And how it ended up with a lot of women is because the men decided, you know, it was too low paid. And a lot of the women who, at certain times in the 19th century, you know, it was difficult to get into college for women then. If they had a scientific bent, they would try and join the observatories and do this quite low-paid manual work. But a lot of them, as is often the case with sharp minds, they weren't taught to think. But they began to think for themselves, and they wanted to think for themselves. And a number of the women here present became really famous astronomers. And in fact, the woman standing at the back, in the middle there, is Wilhelmina Fleming, and she was from Dundee. And she emigrated with her husband, and when they got to the States, he dumped her, left her pregnant, homeless, about to have a baby, and she had the good fortune to ask for work with the man in the left-hand corner who was a director of the observatory. And she'd been a teacher in Scotland, and she was really bright. And she ended up the first American member of the Royal Astronomical Society, the first American woman member of the Royal Astronomical Society. And several of these women also went on. She also discovered a type of star known as a white dwarf. I'm sure you've heard of those, and that's that woman there that actually did it. And I couldn't believe that there was this, story. I was in an astronomy lecture in America, and the lecturer there, the scientist, just mentioned about these women, Harvard computers, just for like 30 seconds of an hour lecture, and that was enough for me to want to know more, and ended up a documentary on them. And I just think it's absolutely fantastic. And what they did as well, they actually improved upon the work that was already being done there, because as well as analysing the stars, if you put a prism in front of light, it separates into you get a spectrum like the rainbow. And they would do that with the starlight too. And they could tell, you'd get also across that spectrum, you'd get like a barcode of little lines, and that would tell people, because where those lines were corresponded to certain elements. So then they were able to tell what was in the stars, that there was hydrogen, that was helium, what was going on in all these stars. And there was already an existing classification of the stars in terms of how hot they were and what have you. And it was alphabetical, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And the women realized that it was wrong. And they told the director, and so it had to be reordered. And that classification by these women is still in use today in astronomy. And it's O, instead of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, it's O, B, A, F, G, K. Got it right? And the reason have to remember it is OBF, fine girl, and kiss me, which is how you remember. Where O is the hottest star, the blue stars in the belt of Orion, that's an O-class star. And at the other end, you've got M, kiss me, M, and that's a cool red star. Like in the corner of the top of Orion, that's one of those stars, I think it's the left-hand side one, is Betelgeuse. And these women helped classify that. And when I was making this documentary, I went to Harvard, was in where they stored them. There are over 1 million of these photographic plates showing stars, and they've now been digitized because they're helpful, because they're a picture of the night sky from hundreds of years ago. So they're incredibly useful even today. And there was a big poster on the wall saying, one of the surviving Harvard computers had come to talk, and she looked very old on that picture, and I looked at the date, and it was about 5 years, earlier or something, about 10 years later, and I was like, and I said, if only, been around. And they said, she's still alive. And it turned out, this woman here, Dorrit Hoffleit, and that's her as a graduate, and so she sort of says she knew all the computers, she worked there. She didn't like to call herself a computer because she actually was one of the ones that came in when there were women's colleges. She'd got a degree, as you can see here. And she was 96 when I met her, so I got a train up from Boston to New Haven, and I rang her up, and they said, and she's still working at the university at 96 years old. Went to interview her, and she was still writing and publishing papers on the moon, on meteors, you name it, she was doing it. And this is Dorrit on her 100th birthday, and sadly she died just a couple of weeks after that picture was taken. But quite incredible. I mean, that picture of her as a graduate was taken in 1928. And what struck me about her was her passion. She was totally, 96 years old, she was sharp as a button, still publishing science pictures and totally into what she does. And that's something that I've noticed with all the scientists I've met. They love their jobs. They really do. You go into the BBC, my God, people moan. They really know, and I say that I've worked there on and off for more than 20 years, and you know, they can moan for Britain. They can. But scientists, no, they do love what they do. They're really passionate. And even people who have not gone into professional science also have that passion if they've got an interest. And I did a series called Citizen Science for Radio 4 as well, which is about the people who do lots of science, even though they're not scientists. And in this case, it was the orchid hunters. And I apologise for showing quite a bit of cleavage there in the middle, but this was us looking at a bee orchid, one of the bee orchids, and the producer Fiona is there to my left after we doing the interview. And then there are also the scientists. In fact, it was Amy who was talking to you earlier. Was it Amy? Yeah, saying that she just discovered a computer program, a game called Fold It, which is all about folding proteins. And that's one of the great things about computers now, and is that if you're interested in science, you can do science now. I belong, there's also a program where you can analyse, you can use your spare, if your computer's sort of idling, basically, you know, and it's sort of downtime, instead of your screensaver popping up, you can download a screensaver from a university or a scientific organisation that will then use your computer to analyse some data. And in that way, you can help look for target molecules for proteins to help cancer, for drugs or what have you. I belong to one called Planet Hunters. So if you're ever a bit bored, you know, I just go on to, this isn't a screensaver, but you can just go onto the website and you analyse the movement of planets to see whether you've found a new one or not. So I'm basically looking for extraterrestrial planets. The sort of people who go out, you know, looking at examining birds and moths and do moth trapping, these are all citizen scientists. So, and they do share that passion. And this guy here, he's an oceanographer and at the University of Plymouth. And his science actually came as a result of his passion. And when he was younger, he was a European surfing champion. And it was as a result of constantly surfing and being fascinated by the sea that got him into wanting to know more about how the waves move, what they do, how ocean currents contribute to the climate and the world we live in and the dynamics of the earth. And there I was interviewing him, they were doing research on riptides, which can be extremely dangerous. And they were following what went on in a riptide, because in fact not much research has been done on riptides at all. And the other scientists for that same series, just to give you an idea of the range, I never judge scientists as the sort of how I looked aged 11, the sort of, you know, geeky, socially inept, don't know things, because that is far from the truth. They're usually very creative, musical, artistic, very literate, you know, incredibly broad. In fact, the most narrow-minded people I've met, I'm going to offend some people here, have been English graduates. Because they say, oh, I don't want to know about science. And you think, well, scientists say, oh, I don't want to read a novel. You know, you just don't get that limitation the other sort of way round. And there was one who was a scientist, a woman who was a stand-up comedian in America. And so she was using her love of comedy. Her science was artificial intelligence. And one of the ways that is trying to get computers and robotics and anything that uses, trying to simulate artificial intelligence to make things more human. You might have heard of the Turing test, where you can go onto the computer and see if you can guess whether you're doing a question and answer with a computer program, or whether there's a real person on the other end. And she decided something that made people human was humour. And so for her, as somebody who dealt with comedy, she basically wrote programs that gave computers a voice and a sense of humour. Not always successful, it has to be, but it was just great to see how she was using what she was interested in with her science. There was also a scientist I met who was a very accomplished musician and singer, and he sang in the sort of choral orchestra with Simon Rattle conducting, so at a very, very high standard. And he was a psychologist. His research was about the psychology of music and how you can change people's behaviour by the music. I mean, you've probably, if you've heard a piece of music that makes you cry, it's very moving. More often than not, they're violins. It's usually at a point where there's a violin. It can affect your behaviour in as much as if you're in a supermarket and they're playing French music, recognisably, I don't know whether it's accordions or what have you, people buy more French wine than if they try with a sort of papa, people will go for the German. So it's amazing what, you know, the sort of variety and range of different sciences that do go on. And there's an artist as well who found that she was a theoretical physicist and found that by painting abstract paintings, it helped her think about her physics and about her science. So these are, I would say, astonishingly successful scientists who are also using the world around them and what they're interested in as part of their world. And it doesn't always have to be pure science, though, that as a journalist that somebody who communicates science that you end up doing. You can also just do investigative stuff as well. And this is a program that I just, to do with a program I love. These are the Mercury 7, very famous in the 60s. I think John Glenn is the second from the right there, who pushed the boundaries of, and they were all fighter pilots. I don't know whether you've ever seen that fantastic film, and it was based on a book, brilliant book, The Right Stuff. These men were considered to have the right stuff to go into space. Pilots, all the right flying hours, and willing to risk their lives. A lot of these would be test pilots on planes in the 60s, and they were chosen for the American space program at a time when nobody knew what going into space would do to you. It was a complete unknown. And so the tests that they did for them were quite horrendous. They put them in those centrifuges at the end of the line, spun them around until they vomited. They stuck tubes up their backsides, gave them enemas. They really pushed them. And I came across them in about 1997, what I hadn't heard of and had no idea, that actually at the same time, there were a bunch of women also doing those tests. And they also had been chosen, and they were pilots. And here are a few of them. Irene Leverton. She was still test flying planes in her 70s. The wonderfully named Wally Funk. Best name ever. Wally had more flying hours than John Glenn. Jerry Truehill, who actually ended up divorcing, or her husband divorced her, because he couldn't cope with the fact that she could possibly be considered as an astronaut. They did it in secret, though. And the man who sort of organised it was, it was called Lovelace. It had a clinic called the Lovelace Clinic. And there's one of the women, that's Jerry Cobb, actually doing, I think that is the centrifuge test, doing the same test as the blokes. And unfortunately, what prevented them from going into space was a sort of combination of opportunity and the attitude of the time. In that one NASA official was quoted as saying he'd rather send a bunch of monkeys into space than women. So it was a tough time, which is why the program was called Right Stuff, Wrong Sex. Because they all had the right stuff. They all passed those tests. And that was the last we heard, that it was just a no-go. So those sort of things really interest me as well, is finding out stuff that's there, little nuggets of gold that you just have to find. And I tracked down about 7 or 8 of the women who were still alive, and went over to the States and interviewed most of them for that. And these are, they call themselves the Mercury 13, because there were 13 of them. And there's Wally Funk, second from the left. The woman in the middle is Jerry Truehill, and Irene Leverton, who was the test pilot, is on the end there. So pretty amazing women. And they were here for, see the space shuttle in the background, and although an American woman had already gone into space, this was more important for them. This was the first time that an American woman was a commander of the shuttle, and she was a pilot. And that's what, you know, that did it for them, Sally Ride. Now, I mentioned that I'd spent 8 years in TV. It's funny, in a way, although TV, people always, you know, think that's the most glamorous side of it, I'd rather do a Radio 4 documentary any day. You get so much more, you get a lot more science in it. You get a lot more control of what you're doing. Often in TV, they will take somebody who might have very qualified in terms of the science to do stuff, and then you're not allowed to write your own material. They'll have somebody else do that. Whereas with radio, there's much more in terms of what you can do and what you want to do and how you can shape it going, because it's a smaller sort of medium. And funnily enough, considering I did TV for 8 years, there's nothing to show you, really, apart from this. That was showing the device. It was almost a little bit like Tomorrow's World, in that the old science program Tomorrow's World, is that whenever anything appeared on that as the next possible thing, it was like the kiss of death. It's never likely to happen again. But actually these possibly, funnily enough, I saw something in the newspapers recently about these eyeglasses that project an image onto the glass that you can see, are actually starting to be considered now. And that was done probably about 10 years ago. So you can see how long, when it comes to technology and science, is not just technology, science, that things actually come to go round, that they're thinking of doing it. And again, this might be a reason why I was more keen on radio than TV. I had to do the science of the bra. Although actually it was much more interesting than I thought it would be, because it turned out there was this sort of up-and-coming businesswoman who was determined to get a new bra onto the market. And it involved so much science and engineering you wouldn't believe. It took her years to get it right, and to get the engineers and to do all the forces that were involved. And her name was Michelle Mone, who's now her Ultimo, or Ultima, is it, or Ultimo? I think it's Ultimo bra. She's like a multi-millionaire now. So in fact, that woman had the right idea. I didn't do all fluffy stuff, I had to add. I did cover a lot of news, but these were only the pictures I could find. And I did work for Newsnight for a bit, and helped to uncover how banking security was flawed. I found a computer hacker who managed, and I set up some accounts, and within about 10 minutes, we filmed him what he would do. He hacked in and had moved the money around without any knowing. And then when it's sort of internet banking, it was the sort of start of it then. And as a result of that, all the high street banks had to change their security. So I wasn't too popular. I know, we all like penguins, don't we? Shortly after I left the BBC, I've worked for the BBC twice, sort of as a studio manager to begin with, and then becoming a producer, then left to become freelance in 8 years. And then I always sort of get like an 8-year itch and then go back for it. And then I was as a correspondent full-time for 8 years. And then I get a bit twitchy and think, oh, now I need to do it. And in fact, one of the first things I did when I was coming back was go to Oslo for a polar science conference. And I met a scientist who worked with penguins. Anyone know what that one is? I think the clue is in the rock. Is that a mackerel? I think it's a rock hopper. Could be wrong. That's an emperor. And the guy there is José Xavier, who's from Portugal and works for the British Antarctic Survey as well. And he's interested in seeing how can polar mammals, so it could be seals, it could be penguins, how they're coping with the sort of changing climate in Antarctica. And he's a marine biologist, and he wants to know how that can adapt, because obviously with climate change, how is that going to affect everyone's there? And particularly something like albatrosses, they face extinction if we're not careful. They often use satellite tracking to actually monitor where certain birds go, and it's quite a common technique. They can tag them. In this case, you wouldn't have something as huge as that's on that penguin. More often than not, for like an albatross, and I've seen them, they are tiny, that go around their legs. And then they use satellites in space to track where the birds are going, where they're feeding. When food supplies are particularly low, maybe it's been there's been an ocean circulation change, it changes the feeding habits of the whole food chain. And a satellite in space is brilliant for finding, well, where are they going to check food? And then you can also on the ground check the numbers and see what's going on there. And he spent a lot of time in Antarctica, but it's not necessarily lonely, and I asked him, so I said, send me a few pictures. I said, I want to show people what it is that you do. And look, it's just amazing, that's one of the things he does. Now, I mentioned that, environmental science is something, and the Planet Earth podcast is something that I do for the Natural Environment Research Council. And that's something that changing technology really helps in terms of getting science across to far more people than you would think with podcasts. But what it also is, it's a different audience. It's a younger audience. And these podcasts have 200,000 downloads, each one. And that's more than people who read The Guardian. So it's changed, and it's the audience that's, is the interesting thing. All of you could make a podcast tomorrow. Might not be any good. No, some of you, probably the younger ones, have probably made really good ones. You just need a laptop. You can get free software to edit your material. Or what you want to do is try not to edit your material and just do retakes until you get something that you're happy with that you don't have to edit it with. That's my husband Richard at the back, who is also, and we met through News 24, so he's a science journalist as well. You need a microphone. See that little fluffy thing? There, that's a microphone. That's just a windshield on it. In my left hand, an iPhone. You can get fantastic apps now. And if you've got an iPhone, the recording quality on them is brilliant. So you can actually record and edit and then publish onto the internet on an iPhone. This is something I did only last week for the Planet Earth podcast. Natalie is Dutch. And she researches avalanches. She does do some research in the Swiss Alps, and they have a monitoring station. But actually, you'd have to hang around for a pretty long time on the off chance that there was an avalanche. What they can do is sometimes they actually drop explosives from a helicopter and cause an avalanche to happen in obviously a very secure area, and then watch as this avalanche can travel. They can travel up to about 100 miles an hour. And the powdery snow that you get at the top can go up to about 100 meters high. And then they have monitors that will measure the speed, measure the direction. But they're interested in knowing what happens in terms of an avalanche and what causes avalanches, because it affects where you build roads, where you put buildings. So it's quite important. It's quite important, but. Can anyone guess what's going down that conveyor belt? See, there's a conveyor belt to her right. Flour? Almost, not quite. Sand, yeah, sand. Very fine as flour. It's very fine sand. And it turns out that how sand behaves, very granular, is really similar to how snow behaves in an avalanche. Because when you've got snow coming down a mountainside, you get the fastest movement is in the centre, with the snow moving really, really fast down the middle, and then slower at the sides. And then then if you look at the sides, you see things. That's why you would tend, if you've ever seen them on a film anywhere, you'll see the sort of breakups of bits of snow sort of flying out, only at the sides. And she simulates it with sand from a hopper going down there, and when you watch it go down, it's exactly like watching an avalanche. And you see the exact same processes, and so she's able to study that and then extend her research, use some backups in terms of what goes on out in the field to check in terms of how similar. And so by doing that, she is helping save lives effectively, as well as helping to advise people where to build in when you live in a lovely snowy climate. This is something I did a couple of months ago. British scientists were on a British Antarctic Survey research vessel, and they discovered thousands of new species in Antarctica that they had never seen before. And the thing that the woman's holding at the bottom, that's the Hoff crab. It's actually called, the real name is called the Yeti crab, because they're really white. But the reason this is called the Hoff crab is because of David Hasselhoff. He's an actor who has a really hairy chest. And those crab in the middle, they have lots of hairs, so they've got a really hairy chest, so that's why they called it a Hoff crab. And what the woman is holding behind it is underwater at the bottom, thousands of meters below the sea level, in sub-zero temperatures, and they were only discovered about 15 years ago, so it's probably not even as long as that, very recently. These huge, like pyramid structures, almost like sort of termites' nests, several meters high, them on the ocean floor bed, and out of them they have these hot gases at like 300 or 400 degrees, and they're called hydrothermal vents. And that is the top, the little nose cone of a hydrothermal vent, with some of the sort of sea life that's still clinging onto it and around it, which is sort of, in a way, the sort of beauty of so much science as well, is that you can never know all there is to know in terms of, even in the subject that you're doing. And another bit of research that really tickled me is there's a scientist, Susanna Thorpe, at the University of Birmingham, who's really interested in how sort of our mankind's nearest relatives, sort of apes, what have you, how they move and how they went from 4 to 2 feet. How that movement of going up. And she's specifically interested in orangutans, one of our closest relatives, and the energy that they use traveling through the rainforest canopy, the bits at the top of the rainforest. Because if you know how they move, what type of branches they like to cross, what type of trees they use, which things they use to travel and how, it tells you more about their lifestyle. And again, if you're going to do conservation and say try and move animals into a certain area, if you've got completely the wrong sort of environment for them, you could actually be doing more harm than good. And they had a brilliant idea in terms of how to do this. It's like, how do you look at something, think, okay, what do orangutans do? They don't often go on the floor. They do go on the floor sometimes, but they like to use other things. If an orangutan was going from here to there, they wouldn't, just walk across. They would probably put a foot up on here, move across there, maybe jump onto the chair and jump back. If there was something hanging down, they would grab onto that. And that got her thinking. And remember the James Bond film, Casino Royale? Do you remember that opening? If you've not seen it, there's a fantastic opening scene where Daniel Craig as James Bond is chasing a villain in Africa. And in fact, this villain is played by a really famous free runner. And you see James Bond chasing him and just going, whoa, because this man bounces off roofs, jumps through when it's very gymnastic, jumps in and out, use walls to sort of push off in the same way as like orangutans would do. They use the branches to sort of support themselves and to just use that movement. So in fact, they're very clever and smart in terms of how they use the surroundings around them. And that got them thinking, okay, how do we monitor this? They decided to actually get professional free runners. Free running in French is also known as parkour. And the guy in the middle is a professional free runner. And he was one of several, you can see them in action there in the rehearsal, where they just set up a bit like a sort of kids' gym and said, right, you've got to find your way with all sorts from there to there. They had equipment on them so they could measure how much oxygen they're using, the energy that they're doing as they go from place to place. And by doing this, by using free runners, it's actually going to help conservation of orangutans. I mean, you sort of couldn't make that up, really. I just think it's absolutely brilliant. Yet another amazing scientist's work. This sperm whale was stranded on a beach in Kent. And as soon as that happened, often what happens when a whale is they call for scientists like this guy here, Nick Higgs. And see those little things, those pink things? They look like straws. They're the Osedax worms. And the Latin name for them is bone devourer. And that's because those little worms, you get thousands and thousands of them when a whale dies, and normally, rather than being beached, the carcass will fall to the bottom of the seabed. These worms just suddenly, shoo, and they were only found about 10 years ago. Nobody knew they existed 10 years ago. And they literally leave nothing. That's why they're called bone devourers. You don't get anything. And now scientists are beginning to realize that this is why there's in whales, there's like a missing, they can't understand the evolution of whales because they can't find the bones to work it out. And now they've discovered why. It's actually because of these worms, which have no mouths or stomachs, by the way. They just manage to digest it just by attaching onto it in their roots. And before you know it, it doesn't take long, the whole of that whale is gone. Conservation is another area. This was a National Trust restoration project at Stonehenge, where they're trying to recreate the chalk grasslands. These are a couple of the scientists, and they are trying to see how, by restoring the meadows, to see what biodiversity returns. And as a result of that, they're just having an amazing sort of success there. And I told you my obsession with, space, and how at least I did get to meet astronauts. And I've been very fortunate. I met the Buzz Aldrin, who's the second man to walk on the moon. I've met Gene Cernan, who was the last man to walk on the moon. Here's a more sort of recent one. Anybody know who this guy is? Oh, shame on you. He's Britain's only astronaut. That's Tim Peake, Major Tim Peake, or Major Tim, as he's often referred to. And this week is the 50th anniversary of the UK being in space. And a lot of components, like glass on the International Space Station, is made by a company in Wales. Loads of science instruments that are on, you name it, any mission there is, there's bound to be something made in Britain. And in fact, the first thing that landed on Titan, one of Saturn's moons, was made in Britain, in Milton Keynes, by the space scientists there. Here's some British engineering of a rover on Mars, although that isn't actually Mars, it's Stevenage. They have a Mars yard. Because Astrium UK, Astrium are Europe's largest space company, and they have two sites in Britain, Stevenage and Portsmouth, and they have a Mars yard in Stevenage. And although it can get glamorous, I mentioned that I do things for the European Space Agency, and in fact, any European missions often fly from French Guiana. So sometimes my job does become very envious, and that was going there for a launch of a mission. Anybody want to know where this is? Yeah, the Isle of Wight. Huge impact. I was going to give a clue if people didn't get it. That bottom right-hand corner is where rockets, the engines for rockets used to be, British-built rockets used to be tested. It's Highdown, and it's now run by the National Trust, so if you're ever in the Isle of Wight, do go and see it. You see the start of Britain's rocket programme. And a lot of, these are the men who were part of Britain's space history. Some of them worked on like the missiles, Blue Streak missile, which then a lot of the work that was done on Blue Streak missile became, Britain actually did build a rocket, Black Arrow. It launched a British satellite, Prospero, into space 50 years ago, just at the end of last year. And that was the first time, first and only time, a British satellite on top of a British rocket. It was launched in Australia. And tomorrow is the anniversary of Ariel 1, and which is why I put this here, just to let you know, because you might hear things in the newspaper about Ariel 1 or see things or hear things about it tomorrow. This is the world's first international satellite, and the Brits were involved. It was a joint mission between America and the UK. And in fact, recording of the space boffins things yesterday, we found some, we managed to get our hands on some documents, government documents that have been secret for 50 years, which showed, and they've now just been released into the public domain. We've got lots of photocopies of them, and they show what went on, because that worked perfectly. It was the Americans built the rocket and the launcher. The Britons did the science on board, and it operated really successfully for several months until, unfortunately, the Americans were doing a high-altitude nuclear test on the other side of the world from where Ariel was above New Zealand, and they zapped it. And which is sort of inauspicious start to what happened to the UK's space programme. And yeah, but that's Ariel 1. And talking about, how easy it is to make podcasts, if you want to actually do your own stuff in space, that is so much easier than you think. These guys are students, are members of the Cambridge University Spaceflight Society, and they've sent mobile phones up into space on weather balloons. They've written a space app, which is going on board a satellite. It's called In Space, No One Can Hear You Scream. And you can actually apply, if you go online, to see whether you can scream down your mobile phone, make a video of you screaming down the mobile phone, and they're going to send it up into space and see whether it's true or not, whether sound can travel in a vacuum, because they think that the vibration could well still go across. And as we come to the end, I'll just very briefly just set you a little test. Anybody know the connection between this, and this? They're all clones. And that's sort of what led to, the introduction of How to Clone the Perfect Blonde that wrote quite a while ago, and it's probably in desperate need of being updated. It was actually a series of essays, effectively, covering all sorts of different subjects. I tended to write the physics and science, space sciencey ones, and Richard, who's the co-author, my husband, he tended to do the biology ones because he's a biologist by training. Although I did do the how to clone one, and it's hard to believe actually. Dolly the sheep, first mammal to be cloned. It's not that long ago, 1997, and since then we've had cloned cows, pigs, dogs, monkeys, mice. So it's only a question of time that somewhere in the world there will be a cloned blonde or brunette or redhead. And what started off as quite difficult, it took 276 attempts, I think it was, to get Dolly to actually happen. And I don't have a biology background. I only did biology O-level, or GCSE as it's known now, but I only did biology O-level, biology goes physics. Which is why, for me, the science doesn't stop here. So, in fact, I'm very lucky. Next month, in fact, I've just been awarded a journalism fellowship to go to Cape Cod, to the Marine Biological Laboratory, and I applied for this fellowship saying, I edit a magazine called The Biologist for the Society of Biology, and I've not studied any biology past the age of 16. I would like to know some more. And in fact, what I shall be doing while I'm there, I will be cloning. And I will be cloning sea urchins. So hopefully, for you as well as me, you'll see that science covers anything you want it to, actually. And if there are, people who've got their GCSE exams and A-levels coming up, I wish you luck, and I just hope that it's given you an insight into an unbelievable career. It's just so varied, and all I can say is that I sort of wish that I had been clever enough to have been a scientist. But see, even if you're not, don't worry. You can do what I do, which is you get to meet all these scientists, you get to write about it, you get to report about it, you get to interview them, and trust me, it must be almost as good. So thank you very much.